What do we call someone who preaches one thing but practices another? That's a hypocrite, right? Well, it turns out that there were no shortages of hypocrites in 1940s America. One group realized the hypocrisy, and the other was in complete denial. Let's see why. Continuing from the 1945 book Black Metropolis by Dr. St. Clair Drake and Horace Caton. Integrity. The problem which faced America was essentially a moral problem. First, who was America? They're referring to the government, the labor unions, the churches, and the white citizens. In short, America here meant white America as a collective. Now, what was the problem? The problem was that white America preached freedom, equality, and democracy, yet denied those to millions of Negroes. So it was a moral problem because it forced white Americans to choose between truth and hypocrisy. It cut deeply into the cultural contradictions of the society. Again, they preached freedom, equality, and democracy, but practiced segregation, oppression, and exclusion. So the moral problem they had to face cut deep down into the very foundation they claimed to stand on. America was not prepared to meet it, having neither the moral stamina nor the psychological background to deal with it. While there were a few white people who demanded that Negroes be granted complete equality at once, the response of many white liberals was to tell Negroes to be patient, to adopt an optimism unwarranted by reality. There were always exceptions. We know that. Some whites saw the hypocrisy for what it was. But most liberals wanted Negroes to walk slow like turtles, waiting forever before they were ever allowed full equality. For the intellectual maturity and the moral integrity which would make possible the unification of collective aims for a solution of the problem did not exist. Meaning white Americans didn't have the brains or the courage to find a real solution to the problem. Now, why don't the authors just speak it in plain English? Why are they doing all this runaround and big word talk? Because the sweet talking is part of being bound to the academic world. They have to dress it up with the fancy language and use the big words and make it appear like it's neutral. It's not their fault because they're just doing what that world requires. But this is one of the ways that the average person gets barred from the higher knowledge, because a lot of it is veiled in these academic terms and they require translation to be easily understood. Now let's continue. Other white people reacted either with fear or hate. In the South, and often in other parts of the country too, they feared that their prerogatives as white people were being challenged. In the colonial South, voting rights, legal rights, labor rights, land rights, and a whole host of other rights were carved out for one group and denied to the others. Those privileges were provided under the banner of white. That's what made that identity appealing and sticky. Not that there was some grand revelation under the heavens that say we should all be some white people. That's not what it is. It's the simple fact of those perks being denied to others, but given to them. So centuries later, when Negroes began gaining access little by little to those privileges, they feared their prerogatives as white people were being challenged. That was the purpose of buying into whiteness to begin with. To have all the privileges and deny them to others. That gap right in there is what fed their pride, and it allowed meaning to be built around being white. And as that gap closed, they feared the outcome. They were infuriated by the Negro press and were in terror of the emotions which they sensed behind the mask-like countenances of their once humble black servants. There was no background of understanding or even sympathy with which they could interpret the upsurge of feeling on the part of Negroes, nor did their stereotyped notion of the Negro and his place allow them to envisage with tolerance or understanding his new demands. Meaning Southern whites had no reference point to make sense of Negroes demanding rights. The only reference point they had was Negroes being underneath them at the bottom. Their minds projected an old storyline that still told them that Negroes were humble, subservient, and in their place. They couldn't process the idea of a Negro being an equal. If you want to know how that felt for them, then imagine someone trying to convince you that a dog is your equal. How would you respond to that? You're not having it. And neither were they. They could explain his behavior only as the result of a plot of communist agitators, fascist agents, and the subversive Negro press. This was a loop back to the Civil War era. Whites couldn't even imagine Negroes even thinking about freedom back then. When Negroes did think about freedom, it was attributed to Northern whites planting foreign ideas into their minds. And the same thing is happening here nearly a century later. The Negro demands weren't seen as inherently real, but rather something that was instigated by outsiders. America was not mentally equipped to deal with this demand for democracy, equality, and fair play raised by its largest minority, even though it was constantly repeating that the nation was founded on these very principles. Where were they repeating it? The churches, Pledge of Allegiance, speeches, propaganda, and a whole bunch more places. Negroes were looking at this and thinking to themselves, this doesn't make any sense. Now think about a person who goes around the country preaching faithfulness in relationships and putting on the front that they live that way. But behind the scenes, they cheat, have all types of side women, mess around with other people's spouses, and then on top of that, they act like nothing ever happened. Most humans don't like people who are like this because it shows bad character. In their own way, white Americans were this very same thing. As Gunnar Myrdal has stated,
trying to defend their behavior to others, and primarily to themselves, people will attempt to conceal the conflict between their different valuations of what is desirable and undesirable, right or wrong, by keeping some valuations from awareness, and by focusing attention on others. For the same opportune purpose, people will twist and mutilate their beliefs of how social reality actually is.
Meaning people hide their actions that go against their values, and they play mental mind games with themselves so they could live with their hypocrisy. The authors put this quote in here to imply that the hypocrisy of white Americans was due to a deliberate twisting of reality and ignoring what was actually in front of them. When Negro maids quit their jobs in domestic service to take positions in war industries to produce for the arsenal of democracy, many white housewives discovered a plot and an organization whose purpose was simply to annoy them. Like wildfire, rumors spread, and many people firmly believed them, that elaborately financed bumping and pushing campaigns had been organized, although for 75 years, their leaders had been unable to organize Negroes on any such scale for any purpose. The bumping and pushing campaign meant that Negroes were bumping into whites on the sidewalk and pushing past them in the streetcars. Basically acts of rudeness. And whites imagined that this was somehow an organized effort. But the authors point out that there's irony in this, because they say that for 75 years, they couldn't effectively organize Negroes for any meaningful purpose. But somehow now, they somehow pulled off some flawless plan to be rude. So it's just showing how whites were delusional in these instances. Unable to deal with or even face the moral issue involved, America stood frozen and paralyzed before its Negro problem, the divergent and contradictory streams of thought in its culture, and its inability even to envisage a different pattern of race relations prevented it from conceiving a rational approach to a solution. Faced with the problem in its most acute state, it was unable to plan action to meet the impending crisis, which was racial explosion and exposed hypocrisy. Nothing illustrates better the confusion and impotence that existed in race relations than the Detroit riot, which happened in 1943, 2 years before this book was published. Negroes moved into Detroit in large numbers. Job competition was fierce, housing was limited, and sparks began to fly. The government knew, as did all the reading public, that it was just a question of time before racial violence would break out in Detroit. All the evidence was before the people, but the government, the labor unions, the churches, and the solid citizens were powerless to do anything about it. So a society convulsed by fear found itself not only unable to act rationally, but unable to act at all. Again, America resorted to artificial techniques, to magic, in trying to meet the problem. Meaning, instead of directly facing the root issue of white supremacy and their hypocrisy, they resorted to mental magic tricks, the deliberate twisting of reality we talked about earlier. Rather than face the moral issue, society placed its reliance in planning, in frantically organized committees to prevent race riots, in anything that would allow it to escape the reality of its confusion and impotence. So they created surface-level solutions to act like they were real attempts to solve the problem. They were uncomfortable facing the shadow self. A lot of lessons can be gleaned from this, don't you think? I thank you for your time and attention. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.